First and foremost, I want to thank everyone for coming to the webinar today. Happy Wednesday. My name is Amy Manis. I'm the Vice President of Client Experience at Gradient. Gradient is Goodway's modern funnel agency where we treat your media investment as our own. We focus on delivering results through integrated reach and scale across the entire marketing funnel, which we're going to be talking about today, and ensuring every effort is aligned with your objectives. I have the pleasure of being joined by some fellow Goodway Group colleagues. We have Kristen Dick, the Performance Creative Lead at Goodway Group, Scott Blessman, VP of Analytics and Data Insights, and Robert Nishiyama, VP of Strategic Planning. I just want to give everyone a little bit of a download on the way that we're going to do the webinar. Throughout the webinar, it's really going to be a conversation that we're going to have, but feel free to comment or ask questions in the chat. Everyone will be able to see this depending on who you do the to. If you want to do it to just the hosts and panelists in the QA, you can do that as well. You can also ask questions during the QA section after I ask some of the questions to our panelists. We'll allow around 5 or 10 minutes at the end for that. And then if we don't have a chance to get to your questions, we will be emailing a follow-up. So have no worries. We want to make sure that every question is addressed. So with that, we are going to start the first question, not to the panelists, but actually to the audience. So if you can open up the Menti that Matt has put, the question is, when was the marketing funnel invented? So we have different answers. You guys can just click on that Menti in the chat. And the options are 1898, 1904, 1924, 1928, and 1935. We'll give everyone just a little bit of time to put some answers in. Looks like we have a front runner of 1924, but let's see what everyone else thinks.
As everyone goes into ChatGPT and asks.
I know, right? I don't want to allow too much time, right? In the day and age of AI. Well, I will say that it was a little bit of a trick question. Robert and I had a little debate about it. It was actually first introduced in 1898 with the AIDA model, the Awareness, Interest, Desire, Action model. But in 1924, William Townsend applied the funnel metaphor to marketing. So if you answered 1898 or 1924, you guys are both considered correct. And in 1924, it was 100 years ago. So we're going to grab onto that number. In 1924, there were 2 billion people on the planet. Today, there are 8 billion, right? We've got 4 times that since the marketing funnel was introduced. And in 1924, the primary form of media was live events, newspapers, and radio. And today, it's not uncommon for consumers to have hundreds of media touchpoints throughout their entire day across smartphones, computers, TV, radio, out-of-home, podcasts, social media, wearables, and the list goes on, and the list will continue to go on as more things are developed. So no one's going to argue the world has changed and it's going to continue to change. But we still need to progress consumers through the stages from awareness down to acquisition. The path is not linear. Consumers are inundated with information overload from privacy concerns, health issues, political polarization, cost of living increases, climate change. There is no one-size-fits-all approach for a consumer. There's no one journey. There are literally 8 billion journeys. Or in the US, 334 million that look different from one day to the next, right? So how do we create strategic plans through the journey? How do we measure through the journey? And what are the key variables that really can make an impact? And this morning I was reading kind of some of the news alerts, and I love that McKinsey's report was released just, I think, a couple weeks ago. And the report is Connecting for Growth, a makeover for your marketing operating model. And it said 87% of CMOs believe brand building is strategically important, but only 58% rate that their company as mature or extremely mature operationally to be able to do it. And the gaps, what they see in terms of being able to really recognize it and implement it, are around 3 things. And just so happens we're talking about those today. So I think that we're just spot on. It's around KPI clarity, So talking about measurement, Scott, strategic budgeting, so strategy and planning, Robert, and defining a creative strategy. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. I just love that. I was like, how on point are we? And we started talking about this a few weeks ago. We've had a few conversations, and it's going to be some great dialogue, but I also do want to make sure that people feel free to ask questions, and I've encouraged the panelists to do so as well as we're kind of engaging. But my first question is to Robert. When we think about strategic planning, can you tell me more about the importance of taking a full funnel marketing approach in a world where we have these nonlinear journeys?
Yeah, great question. I think in this day and age, taking a full funnel marketing approach is more important than ever. If we take a step back, over the past few years, there has been such a tremendous focus and attention on lower funnel marketing or performance-based marketing. And the reason for that is because, it's a lot easier to get a read in terms of how your media and your marketing investments are paying out in terms of a return. But, by focusing so much on lower funnel activity alone, what you're really doing is just really capitalizing on the demand that's already in place. And by taking a full funnel marketing approach, what you're really doing is using a full funnel marketing approach to fuel demand and ultimately capitalizing on that demand with lower funnel activity as well. So the interesting thing here about taking a more full funnel approach is that you're not necessarily moving away and shifting away from a lot of that lower funnel activity. What you're really doing is making a lot more of that lower funnel activity far more efficient and far more effective by taking a more full funnel marketing approach.
And do we think that there is a shift for brands, that they're recognizing this need to kind of move up the funnel from a brand perspective? And if so, why?
Absolutely. So the pendulum is starting to swing back a little bit more to kind of look at things from a more full funnel marketing perspective. And I think part of the reason here is, the industry is kind of shifting more towards driving profitable growth. And in order to drive more profitable growth, you can't just focus on lower funnel activity. You have a lot more brands that are competing and using their dollars for more full funnel marketing. So in order to compete and win in this new day and age where you compete against a lot of different brands and a lot of, trying to capture the attention of consumers, taking a full funnel marketing approach is more of a necessity more than anything else in order to win in this new world.
And what is the right balance between, if I'm a brand that's largely focused on bottom funnel activities and from a budget perspective, what is that right balance when we think about investment level of demand versus brand?
Absolutely. So no one likes to hear this answer, but the reality is it all depends. There's a lot of different, research studies that have been done in terms of what is the right balance in terms of upper funnel versus lower funnel. And those are all well and good. But I think a few things to kind of take into account here is that it's all going to be vastly different category by category and where your brand actually is within the overall competitive landscape as well. So a very well-established brand who has a rich history that people are aware of might have a very different approach in terms of how they would allocate their investments in terms of upper funnel, mid funnel, and lower funnel. If you're a new brand, new to the category, that will look vastly different as well. So even category by category, but where you are in terms of being a new entrant versus an established brand is certainly going to vary. I think the other piece here too is that, because there has been such a significant investment and focus on lower funnel activity over the past recent years, there are many brands who, have predominantly a majority of their overall spend focused in on that lower funnel activity. So to kind of, switch things out and kind of flip things on its side to kind of focus a lot more of your investment on upper funnel and mid funnel, it's a seismic change. And I think what's important here is that you kind of need to take those small steps to some of your dollars away from lower funnel activity, start testing things out, understanding what works and what doesn't work. But it's not going to be one size fits all. And I think it's going to be very different brand by brand in terms of where you are today and where you want to get to next.
And how do you start to take that step? Because when you think, when you think of brand, right, you think of these high reach mediums and often very costly, not able to be, as targeted. Maybe it's kind of, this kind of a blast off to kind of see then what's going to kind of continue to come down the funnel. Are there ways that you can, like you said, be a little bit more strategic and a little bit more small shifts and testing to really understand what's going to work?
Absolutely. So I think the key thing here, when we start talking about full funnel marketing, in order to be successful, you really do need to take a consumer first approach and to build plans based on the overall consumer journey. And the reason for that is, it's not just as simple as saying, hey, we need to generate more awareness, we need to drive more consideration, and ultimately capitalize out on that in terms of conversion. Ultimately, that's probably the end goal. But the issue with that is that it's not actionable in terms of what you can do in terms of your overall media and marketing. So by taking a consumer first approach and looking at things in terms of the actual consumer journey and getting consumers from one stage of the journey into the next, from awareness, consideration, and ultimately conversion, it is really the best approach in terms of how to be successful from a full funnel marketing standpoint.
And that's a great segue into how do we better understand the journey?
Great question. So, there's a spectrum of things that you can do to better understand that consumer journey. On one end of the spectrum are probably more advanced tools and research that is available. A great example would be Nielsen ComSpoint, right? So what they are able to do is really understand, tease out the different categories, understand what those journeys are, the length of time. You may have one category that is vastly different in terms of its timing, in terms of its purchase decision. So like the automotive category, vastly different than something from a CPG category. So Nielsen ComSpoint is able to kind of break that out and look at things in terms of what that journey is, depending on the different category. But in addition to that, it can also look at what are the right media and marketing touch points that are able to get consumers from one stage of the journey into the next. So that's, obviously the more advanced approach. On the other side, I think this is where AI can definitely play a role here. ChatGPT, Perplexity. What's great about this is that it can paint a pretty good picture in terms of what that potential consumer journey is. Obviously, it would require, the right prompts to get the right results. But it doesn't necessarily, to get that view of the consumer journey, it doesn't necessarily require sophisticated advanced research and tools. Certainly helpful, but there are other ways that are cheaper, sometimes even free, that can start to paint a picture of what that journey actually is.
Right. We know that there are so many versions of the journey, right? It's not one.
Yep.
So let's use
Exactly.
the tools that we have available. How do you identify or look at and understanding some of the pain points along that journey? Like marrying that up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the key thing here, when we start talking about the consumer journey, it really is, an in-depth analysis and understanding in terms of what are the key triggers that would get a consumer to become aware of a particular brand or get them to consider, but also identifying what those key barriers are along that journey as well. So as you're starting to build out what that consumer journey is, what you're really trying to do is identify where those barriers are and what your media and your marketing needs to do to help get consumers from one stage of the journey into the next.
Awesome. Awesome. Right. Talking about like overall communication strategy, what methods do brands use to prioritize communication objectives at each stage? We think about the funnel, we think about the journey, and how do we align that to making sure that we're aligned with like the clarity of what we expect or want consumers to do at each stage, what we want them to think, feel, do? How do we align with that?
Well, it all starts with research overall. I think what's very interesting is that there's so many different potential barriers along that consumer journey, and it's about being very clear and very deliberate about what are the most important barriers that need to be overcome. But not only that, aligning what those key objectives are at each stage of the journey, but certainly leveraging data and getting a better understanding in terms of what are the right data points that will prove successful in getting consumers from one stage of the journey to the next.
And what are some of those data points that we can look at, Scott, from a measurement perspective that kind of give us an idea that, there are gaps or there are issues within that so that we can prioritize different stages?
Yeah, well, gathering all that data actually starts with planning. We need to think about and define, like Robert said, what do we want them to do? What's the next step? What comes after they've been exposed at that touch point? And that's really where measurement comes in to figure out from a data standpoint what's happening. So when we're running these brand campaigns, we might actually look at our brand lift studies that we have in market, but knowing that those are slow to come back to us, a lot of times we're looking at, okay, what's the next step we want people to take, and are they doing that? So if we're running a new CTV campaign, do we see an increase in branded search of people interested in the brand, researching, looking at the website, getting ready to move or signal that they're moving into that next stage of the funnel? We would carry that all the way through the process. An interesting exercise for you to do is, okay, what if they don't do the thing we want them to do? Where's our next best chance at sending them a message? Is it sequential messaging? Are we building a story now, making sure that they have a full feel for the brand, and then when they're ready, they can make that next step on their own? Or do we want to try to hit them in a different channel or a different place? So those data points are really heavily anchored in what do you want the user or the consumer to do next. We know ultimately we're driving conversions here, right? We're going to drive all the way through, but there's a lot of steps from a TV commercial down to that in-store or digital conversion. So along that path, we have to put ourselves in their shoes. If I saw this ad, what would I do next? And then plan for that and ensure we have the right tracking and tagging in place to capture that behavioral data to layer on top of the brand lift studies or that attitudinal metric that we get from surveys.
And I think that brings us to a great point where, while with a media background, I would love to say it's all about, is it a TV spot linear? Is it connected TV? Where are we hitting them? Are we making sure that it's our right target? At the end of the day, a lot of times what consumers are reacting to is really about creative. And how do we make sure that we're ensuring creative is not only cohesive, but relevant to the audience segments as we look at, it through the journey?
Yeah, I think
Kristen?
that's a great question. The way that we find that do this most successfully is when we're really in lockstep from a research and planning perspective, and we like to layer in qualitative research methods like actually interviewing the customer or the end audience that we're going after so that we can hear exactly how they're articulating the pain points they encounter that your product or your service seeks to solve. When you can kind of hear it from the horse's mouth, you can articulate it in a way that can be more compelling and can, look at driving stronger action. So we like to really make sure we're in lockstep with whatever research is informing our overall media strategy. How are we taking those learnings and implementing that from a creative element within the different audiences we're going after, and depending on what stage of the buying journey that we're in. The message that someone gets at the top of the funnel should probably look a lot different than your retargeting campaigns when you're actually trying to drive a point of purchase. And so we're in lockstep with, okay, what behaviors do we want them to take immediately next? Kind of like what Scott was just talking about from a measurement lens. What behaviors can we actually track in that way? That also drives a lot of our messaging strategy from a creative standpoint. So if, we're an awareness campaign and we want someone to recall our brand, that is a much different message or creative strategy than someone that we want to add to cart or book an appointment to go into a storefront or something of that nature.
How do you make sure they're connected though, right? You said it's a very different message and strategy, but how do you make sure that it connects so it feels to the user, right? Like I'm naturally progressing, obviously you don't think about you're naturally progressing down that stage, but it doesn't feel so disconnected, right? Like I'm seeing this, I'm entertained or informed, and then it's like, bye, right?
Yeah. Well, the brand book and the essence of your brand is always the guide. Every brand has a unique POV within their industry. Every brand has a specific tone of voice that their creative teams have worked really hard to cultivate over the years. And so performance creative still honors that. That's still our guide and how we really think about things. We just really we're using data to hone within those guardrails in many ways, because you do want to exude a brand experience that makes sense no matter what touch point we're talking about. We want it to feel cohesive to the user because they're probably going to see your ad or your brand in multiple places, right, over the duration of a year, 18 months, 2 years. And so you want them to be able to say, oh yeah, I know that brand because you have consistency, and that's the point of the brand book, and that's your guardrail. But there's still a lot of opportunity to be testing and iterating within that based on where your media is being placed, who your audience is, what their intent is with your brand, and so on and so forth.
And you guys have a really structured kind of exercise that you work with as it relates to performance marketing and creative, and like a test and learn. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, great question. So we deeply believe in always on testing. So all of the partners that we're working with from a creative standpoint, we typically recommend that they're allocating 5 to 10% of their media budget to creative testing. Now, sometimes that's creative testing that helps complement or fuel audiences, new audiences that they're trying to expand into, or what have you. We kind of align on where we want to focus that budget or that resource on any given month, depending on the business needs. But what we typically do is when we immediately plug in, what we often find is most of our partners haven't spent time actually testing the positioning or the value props that really move the needle against their campaigns, whether that's like an awareness campaign or some, consideration campaign in the middle of the funnel, or a conversion campaign. They've, gone about testing maybe static versus carousel versus different types of video, but they haven't really like put the pedal to the metal to understand which messages drive the strongest results. And from what we've seen working with a ton of different clients is if you can nail the messaging, that's when you see the biggest swings in data improvement. So we almost always start there, where we're working really closely with their brand teams. We're looking at their competitive set. We're trying to understand which unique value props around the product will help them stand out amongst their competitors, and really like drive action or drive ad recall or whatever that KPI is that we're chasing against their audience and with their target market. And so we start there. We build out a testing framework so that we know, it's kind of like a science project. At the end of that testing campaign, we want to walk away with high confidence and high statistical significance that we actually know that this message drove the needle or moved the needle. So we're, keeping ad creative design really similar. The audience doesn't change in a creative test. We're really focused on manipulating like 1-2 variables tops so that we know exactly what drove the results that we saw at the end of it. And then from there, once we've really honed in on the top 3 to 4 ways to articulate what it is that you sell or how to position a certain product, what offer seems to do the best. That's when we get into more like visual art direction testing or testing different types of video marketing or what have you.
So starting with more of the content and the messaging and the call to action and those types of things. And what's the right, like you mentioned always on testing, but if you're starting an engagement with the client and you start testing creative, what is a typical timeline before you see that statistical significance and you start to see like, oh, wow, the aha of the needle really moving?
Yeah, it really comes down to statistical, like what you're spending, and what the goal of the campaign is. So in order to like reach statistical significance, you have to hit a certain number of campaign events. So if it's a conversion campaign, that's usually like 50 to 100 conversions. Well, if your CAC or your cost per conversion is $50, you have to spend a lot more to reach that. To get statistical significance, you have to leave that test on longer compared to if you're, optimizing against a link click or a video view, which is, maybe a 6-second video, 6-cent video view or whatever. So you don't have to spend, it kind of depends on what part of the funnel you're optimizing against so that you can essentially exit learning phases within your test campaigns. And then, of course, if we're earmarking like 10% of our monthly budget to testing, well, 10% for one brand can look really different than 10% for another brand, depending on their total media investment. And so that also really impacts the timeline. Typically, though, our creative tests, we're leaving live for like at least 2 weeks before we call it.
So then, for an average, if you're doing it for 2 weeks, is it safe to say that there's kind of the testing rigor is every month there's a new test, or?
Yeah. So that's our preference, and that's how we built a lot of our workflows. So we'll look at, typically we are kind of working ahead of, we'll have identified like 2 to 3 tests that we want to prioritize over the coming weeks so that you can get ahead of production schedules a little bit, because depending on the brand, depending on the feedback loops, you might not be able to crank out a full round of test creative within a 2-week time period once you get the results back and you're trying to implement something for the next month. So we're usually thinking in 2 or 3 creative test rotations at a time. So just from a production like logistics standpoint. But when we get to that, 2 to 3 week mark when that test is up, we're talking about insights and we're strategizing with our partners on what we want to do with that information and what we want to like tackle next based on what we learned.
And when we think about, I heard, production, it's not, I know creative can be costly. We have AI today's day and age, but I mean, it's really not concept testing, right? We're testing specific variables. So it really is going back and it's a production thing of like tweaking headlines or, right?
It is, but it could also be a concepting. It can also be concepting. So, like for example, we've worked with a partner in the automotive space. They're like early to market to rent solely electric vehicles. What we have been testing is like sharing messaging. They have like, if you're a Tesla owner, you might already be interested in only renting Tesla vehicles. And so we've been really focused on like honing in on that particular market to expand their brand and their brand presence. One thing that we've concepted recently though is as we've like learned more about their brand, they actually have a very great white glove rental car pickup and drop off service. And so we think if we lead with that positioning, we could enter into a new market that, is someone who is a business traveler, a certain household income or what have you. But there's opportunity to concept that way too. And that's more than just tweaking the messaging or the headline. That's developing new storyboards and new video concepts end to end.
Right. Totally different value prop, right? Awesome. I love it. Scott, let's talk about the measurement framework. And the measurement workshop exercises that we do with clients that Scott knows it's one of my favorite things that we do when we do with new clients. And talking about linking the brand and demand together.
Well, I'm happy that you continue to have that be one of your favorite things that we do with new clients. But really, what our measurement frameworks and measurement workshops are intending to do is to tie what Robert and Kristen said into kind of one conversation of what are we trying to achieve? And we base everything on those business outcomes that our clients are trying to drive, and then basically work backwards to figure out, okay, at each touch point, what levers do we have? What metrics do we have available to us that relate to that desired outcome? So we're not just measuring everything for the sake of measuring and trying to find the one good metric here or there. What we want to do is ensure that everything we do from every touch point is ultimately driving folks towards that desired goal. So a purchase, a conversion, signing up, whatever the campaign is really geared around. Now, the key here, though, is that we do it during planning. This can't be after the fact. This can't be the campaign's been running for 2 months. We might need to reevaluate or optimize, but this really needs to be from the beginning. Same with testing. We need to plan to test. There's time needed to get those tests in place and make sure they're working. So the goal here is really finding the right balance between prepping and being responsive, but not being reactive. We don't want to just massively pull creative out of market because the first 2 days of a test it's running slow, or we don't want to immediately turn off a channel because it's not performing exactly the same as something else. We need to give these things time, and we need to make sure, okay, are they hitting the goal? Are they taking another step? And that really then starts to weigh into things like creative wear in, creative wear out, and understanding kind of that overall response to our messaging and not just the targeting. Because there could be a lot of reasons why something is not performing. Maybe it's the wrong message for that audience. Maybe it's the wrong audience for that message. So we really need to be ready to learn and then not react, but be responsive to those metrics and pull back the knee-jerk reactions that I think we tend to fall back on, knowing that budget is out there. Kristen called out a great point, though. Within 2 weeks of a campaign going live, if we're not seeing any change or any movement, good or bad, then we probably need to think about reevaluating that test in the first place. From a significance standpoint, not only at least as an analyst, not only are we looking at volume, we're also looking at the change, how much variance we have between our two tests, and looking at the gap between those. If they're very close to each other and we're not really seeing a lot of difference between those two messages, we will never hit significance. We could spend all the money for years and never hit significance. So we want to make sure when we're testing these things, comparing them to each other, that they actually are showing some change that validates the reason for the test, or maybe tells us, hey, this creative's too similar. Maybe we need to go in and try something different, or what we're doing before was already the best.
Right. And how do you know what goals, from a business perspective, I think, on marketing campaigns, it's easy to say, our main goal is lead generation, or our main goal is CAC, or whatever it is. How do you align it so that, obviously if you're doing branded efforts, they can be much more costly and not driving that immediate action. How do you look at it throughout the funnel so you make sure that you're measuring each part of the funnel correctly, but also looking at it as it relates, like balancing to your business outcome? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it all ladders into what Robert was saying around really figuring out what you want to do at each opportunity you have to talk to the customer. So from a branding standpoint, we want them to do X. We want them to search. We want them to be interested in the brand. It can't be convert. We know from a branding standpoint, most people don't immediately go to the store and buy. They're going to research. They're going to understand what your value proposition is. Maybe they're planning a long-term home remodel and they're not ready to buy, but maybe the other group of folks, their refrigerator died today, and we know that they are going to be more quick to go and purchase, because they have a reason to. Food spoiling, the refrigerator's making noise, whatever that may be. So we really have to think about that mindset and where those opportunities exist within each one of those touch points, and then think about the metrics that, okay, if we're running a branding campaign, are they then going to the website? All right, now they've gone to the website. Once they're there and we're hitting them in that more mid-funnel stage, are they now shopping and comparing? Are they comparing brands? Are they doing more of the behaviors that we would expect someone to do who is considering really making that purchase ahead of going to the store and, kind of doing the seat test where you sit down, make sure everything's comfortable and in the right spot, but really have that plan so that they are ready and informed when it comes time to make that decision. Now, the way we ladder these all together is, again, we need to start with those goals from the very beginning. And then on each step, Robert mentioned earlier, demand gen's been such a heavy focus for us because we can target more tightly. We can hit people more rapidly with dynamic creative. We can custom tailor messaging just for them. But where we go from there is, what if we've hit all of that audience? We've already expanded to every person that's in that buy stage. Now, where do we go? And that's where we start working backwards. And now we've got, okay, we're here for the people who are ready to buy. The people who are interested to buy will eventually move into that group. Where are opportunities for expansion? And then it turns a little bit into invest, test, and contract into that optimized kind of framework. So as we're working through each one of those, we're keeping in mind, how are we driving those behaviors that lead to those desired outcomes?
So what I'm hearing is that even if it is a brand upper funnel, effort, and you're doing things like, out of home or CTV or, linear, that there should be still an action that you're measuring, right? It doesn't have to be CAC or ROI or bottom funnel, but still measuring something, and then understand how it connects further down. We've seen a lot of clients kind of look at how they leverage the holistic, right? Yeah, you've got your business outcome in terms of sales or whatever that may be, but starting to look at how it works together as it relates to MMM or incrementality. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how to consider what you should be doing as it relates to something like that, or if you should be investing in something like that? It can be quite costly.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of us tend to default, oh, we need to run an MMM, or, oh, this needs to be an incrementality test. I think incrementality is going to be more and more important to our customers, to our clients, in terms of how they spend their money, because we're prioritizing budget based on what's been proven or we believe will be proven to kind of drive that next purchase that we wouldn't have gotten before. It goes back to that expand, test, and kind of optimize mentality I talked about earlier. But the key here is really, what are we trying to measure or do or understand? If we're looking at incrementality and we're looking at the way we're investing, we might look at a small market investment and then expand live to understand, across the full US, will this increase our growth, and will this give us more audience than we would have hit before? Now, on the flip side of that, if we want to understand, have we maxed out our audience, then we might be looking at an MMM. And MMM will kind of be there to help us know, is there more opportunity within this channel or within this audience? And if not, if we've hit the point of diminishing returns, how do we shift that line to then open it up to more? And then we go back to incrementality. So realistically, we could run these two things hand in hand throughout the campaign and make sure that, kind of have that checkpoint from an MMM standpoint. Are the things we doing moving the needle? Where do we see the need to pull back? Where do we see the opportunity to push forward? Ultimately, though, these can all be running together. They don't need to be independent. We should be thinking about what are those main learnings that we want to get, and how do we then achieve kind of that next step for us from an investment standpoint. So when you're thinking through, should I run an MMM? I think the first question you should ask yourself is, do I have enough data to actually see movement? Meaning, did I run a bunch of incrementality tests? And we saw when we invested here, sales went up. When we pulled back, sales went down. Having that variance in your data actually helps you to get a much better read, because we're seeing the fluctuations, not just keeping the status quo. A lot of times when we're just kind of running a campaign and we run an MMM, it might look like we have unlimited potential. The sky's the limit. The more money in, the more money out. And it's not that case. We need to have those different points that exist. And that's where incrementality, or even just creative testing, things like Kristen went through, really play a factor into this, because it lets us know, okay, here we are, we've got variance within our display campaign. We see certain creatives, certain audiences popping, some going down. There's a seasonality impact. Now we've got a nice, robust data set that lets us make those decisions. But we don't get that data without running tests like incrementality or some of those other options that we may have from an A/B standpoint.
I love some of the tools that we have that we can use. And I feel like I've been programmed from Scott and our data sciences team. It's not about the tool, it's what question are we trying to answer, right? And that's the way that we've set up a lot of our clients, like workshops, when we look at like testing, right? What questions do we want to answer? So we've had some questions. And Scott kind of hit on the last one, that was incrementality and MMM together. Another question we've had is from a creative perspective. And we've talked about this, Kristen, in some of our prep calls, like how do we look at a cohesive experience from a creative perspective, from upper to lower funnel, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about that, but I feel like so often, today it's either you're polarized, right? It's either they all look the same or they look so different, right? So how do you make sure that you kind of align your messaging in the upper and lower funnel? And what's the right kind of balance of that as you kind of slowly move down the funnel?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's something a lot of teams really struggle with. In a lot of ways, some key principles. So I'll talk through a client of ours called Viome that I think does a really good job of this, that still leans into performance, and they're looking and going after a CAC target for, when you think about all of their marketing spend, they look at it from an incremental revenue growth, and they look at it from a blended CAC perspective. So yes, we're focused on channel specific CACs, but they're also running top of funnel media in other places as well. And we kind of measure holistic performance using a blended CAC number. So Viome is a at-home gut health test kit. So I'm not sure if there's any other health nuts on the call that's super into that hippy dippy stuff, but that's what this company does, is they send you a at-home test kit, and you kind of mail back your, you mail it back, and then you get your results on what you should and you shouldn't eat. And it's really leaning into this sort of trend or movement that's happening now, where everyone's leaning into more holistic health remedies or gut health, really having a major impact on all other parts of your health and things of that nature. And so in many ways, when you think about their brand, the brand that they're building, it's obviously very scientific. They're taking a very complicated topic, They're making it personalized, and they're trying to like break down barriers and educate on holistic health and that approach, and the background and really solidifying and building trust that Viome's process is legit and gives good results. And so they're tackling a really complicated topic and trying to make it simpler. And their like brand tone, their brand voice really leans into some education. So at the top of the funnel, what we find is when across multiple channels, when we feature their founder, who, either from a TED Talk recording or from, just kind of like recording him in a video studio talking about why he founded the brand, that founder story, that really resonates well from a top of funnel perspective. And then, we layer in UGC where they're talking about their personal story tied to Viome, the results that they got back from doing the test from the influencer, or they're talking personally about what Viome has like done for their health after they've had a minute to, obviously take the test and then implement some of the recommendations into their lifestyle. They're recording UGC style, influencer style content, and we're putting media behind it. So it's those like personal stories that really aim to like break down and educate on how this product works, and more than that, what it's done in their lives. So that's really where we focus on top of the funnel, and that's been a really effective communication strategy to build that awareness and build that engagement. But we find that offers are what really drive conversion. And so we test a variety of different offers, different ways that you can discount, different whatever. And for the product, what we've kind of leaned into recently is that $100 off works a lot more, or like an X amount of dollars off is 10 times more effective than a percentage off for a conversion campaign. And so we're really kind of just, in that instance, we're keeping the brand connected from end to end, because in any video, we're saying the name Viome within the first 6 seconds of any video at the top of the funnel. The logo is shown throughout. Consumers are, I think, smarter and more savvy about these kinds of things than what we as marketers maybe give them credit for. We're also showing the packaging when we can, because the packaging is really prominent on their website and other campaign collateral that they use across other mediums. And so we're showing that packaging, which has their logo. It has a lot of their brand essence obviously included in that. And then, of course, we have their branding all over a lot of the lower funnel static assets. And so we're trying to make sure that between the brand name, the use of the logo, and then the way that the packaging is sort of shown throughout all the concepts, it really ties in the brand experience end to end. I think another thing that we run into is that internal teams can overthink making sure the brand is really connected from top of funnel to bottom of funnel. And so one way that we've tackled this really successfully, and a lot of times the whole concept of data-backed performance creative decisions is taking that like subjectivity out of creative and really using data to help add an additional layer to the decisions you're making around creative for your brand. Same can kind of be true for this concept. So we will take a sample size of 2 or 3 customers. Maybe they're like our super fans for a brand. And we will Scott talked about sequential messaging. We'll take a look at, here's how we're going to put together our entire campaign. Here's an example of an ad from the top of funnel. Here's what we're going to put in the middle of the funnel. And here's what we're going to do at the end of the funnel. Can you react to this and give us some feedback on it? And that's been a really great tactic to sort of validate whether or not that is confusing to an actual consumer before we over debate it as a team.
Yeah, it's hard working on a brand or so close to a brand, the brand best, but it's almost like in the back of your head, you're like, well, duh, I know that. And then looking at it from a consumer perspective, I love that. So thinking about it, your founder messaging, UGC content, and then kind of the offers is so clear, but then you also have some of those things that are consistent throughout. How long did, from the engagement to be able to come up with that, here's our approach, here's what's going to work for the different phases of the funnel?
So when Viome came to us, they had already identified the meat and potato, they've been running, they spend about $500,000 a month on social advertising, plus, other channels that they're activating on. And so they had a wealth of data at our disposal. And so we were able to go through and historically analyze what they had been doing to kind of build the frameworks around what we thought would work and what we didn't. So we had the luxury of having a lot of really clean historical data to help drive our initial recommendation. And from there, we've been just kind of honing it. So our initial findings from looking at the last 2 years of data, actually was pretty spot on to what we're seeing work now that we're kind of rolling out additional testing. Now we're really focused on, over the last few months, we're focused on like the landing page experience and making sure that that's cohesive with the brand message, from like middle of the funnel down to conversion campaigns, to help improve conversion rates overall and engagement rates overall. And then we really like have been able to hone in on specific styles of influencers that seem to best resonate with their audiences. And so now we're kind of testing within some of those larger findings to keep honing in.
What and this can be for anyone, right? I know we use a lot of data, especially, you know, obviously in analytics, creative, but you said they had a lot of really clean data, right? What is ideal? Everyone has a lot of data, right? But what, you know, what is the ideal in terms of making sure that you've got clean data, right? Like what, as a marketer, and I've got a lot of data, how do I know if it's clean, or what should I be doing today to make sure that moving forward it is clean?
Great question. And I'm sure Scott has a phenomenal point of view on this. From where I sit and what my team does, what we often run into is that naming conventions aren't standardized. And so we're not able to, when we're looking at a huge data set of 1, 2, 3 years, if we can't, you know, pull out key elements of whatever that naming convention is to group certain ads or certain ad sets together over that period of time, it can be really hard to look at a longer time period and draw the insights that we need to. Sometimes we have to like manually go back in and rename those things ourselves so that we can get there. And so it's naming conventions for me come to mind. And then one, Viome had a history of testing on their own before we started partnering together with them. And so we were able to really lean into how they structured some of their historical campaigns to help drive that. So they had like a clean testing environment. When they did test, they weren't doing it as often as what we would recommend. But when they were testing, it was a very clean like data environment. There were like minimized variables so that we knew exactly what drove the results, that, you know, we could tell very clearly what they were testing and what was driving the results. But for me, it's like all about the naming conventions and making sure they're really organized.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Kristen, for calling out the naming conventions, because that's a huge part of what your analytics team probably has to do a lot of the time, is take that data and then make sense of it. And the more we're consistent in how we make sense of it, the faster we will be to turn things around. To add to that, I think the setting up from a measurement standpoint, so setting things up, naming conventions, tagging, doing all of that, we need to have a lot of rigor around those pieces in order to ensure the data we're getting is the data we expect, and that data is then actionable against what we're trying to achieve. Now, it doesn't just have to stop there. We could look at putting an identity partner in line, and then have some identity resolution, and that's going to clean your data up even more, because now we know who we're touching, where the message is hitting with them, and then if they're actually driving that and becoming a customer, we can then take that list and say, okay, now they're a customer, let's make them a loyal customer. And it gives us a higher fidelity of the data from a more one-to-one perspective. You don't need to do that necessarily. We can look at relationships and how things shift together, but having that one-to-one data is really kind of like the standard of having the cleanest view of what's actually happening. But on top of that, it's really making sure your data relates to what you want to do. I'm always going to go back to what is the goal? What is the thing we're trying to achieve? And then ensuring that we have those right metrics. Let's say we are 2 weeks into a campaign and we're running a test and we realize, I don't know if this is successful or not. And now we need to take the time to say, okay, what are we going to do with this learning when we get it? And is the data there to help us get there? And we maybe need to set something else up, find a new opportunity, find a new way to get the information we're trying to hit.
And Scott, to follow up on that, we had a question around, you know, are incrementality and MMM the main measurement methodologies to use when we think about measuring the connection of brand and demand? Or are there any other, I know we've talked about each phase through the funnel, right? So, you know, if you've got brand and you're doing TV, you know, are you looking at overall reach and frequency? Are you looking at site traffic? Or, you know, so there are stages through the funnel, but what are the ways that you think are the best to measure everything overall?
That's a great question, and it ladders back to what I said earlier about what happens if they don't do the next step. It's real easy to say we ran a brand campaign and then our site visits went up. Like that's a great standard metric we could look at. We can make the correlation between the investment and see where those go in. Very similar to how we would look at creative, wherein a message goes into market. 5 days later, we start seeing activity pick up, and those lines start moving and reacting to each other. Those are really simplified ways to think about measurement. You don't need to spend the money to do an MMM necessarily. That's going to help you understand your investment going forward or what channels can help each other out. But I wouldn't put the weight in that because they take a while to run. We can't optimize off of an MMM to see which creative's performing better because it takes us 6 weeks, 8 weeks to get the results from that. And the more data we have, so we need to let it run a longer time, help those curves make sense. So is it the only thing? Absolutely not. It's understanding those channel relationships that go into place and what would happen after, but then also talking about reach and frequency. What if they don't take that next step? Do we just keep hitting them with the same message until they frequency out? And then we hope in 30 days they're ready to buy this time and we start messaging them again? Or is it a longer story? Are we telling them a longer message, creative 1, creative 2, creative 3, and now we're telling a more complete opportunity for that home remodel, for that long-term project that they might be shopping for? Another great way to actually understand if your brand is working well, look at social listening. That's a much cheaper alternative than doing some panels or doing brand lift. You can get a license, you can get in there and start seeing what consumers are saying about your brand. Or if you're repositioning, maybe see if they start responding to your messaging and what you're talking about and who you are. That's a great way to get an understanding of, is the message wearing in? Are people interested in leaning in? Or are we really missing the mark and it's kind of throwing a lot of people off? I think we've all run into the instance where we see an ad once and then we continue to see that same ad all day on whatever media we're consuming, whether it's a YouTube video or we're listening to music or even reading articles, just that same ad comes over and over. There's obviously a problem with the frequency. They're not targeting us correctly. We need to make sure that we're keeping in mind, how does that feel to a user? I know plenty of times we've looked and run social listening and seen folks saying like, oh, I keep seeing this ad. It's so repetitive. I'm tired of hearing it. And that's not necessarily the reaction we're trying to drive. So how do we help balance that out by looking at, okay, our average conversion window is 14 days. So maybe within a 14-day period, we don't want to hit people more than 5 times. And think about, what does that look like from a user standpoint?
And also, I think a good thing is, what action do we want them to take? And if they've taken it, why are we continually hitting them with, I've purchased things and I'm still getting the message, right? I'm still getting the jeans or the refrigerator, right? It's like, so kind of taking those cues and continuing to have a dialogue that's more of a conversation with them based on the actions they're taking. So I think one of the questions that people have asked, and what I'd like to do is have everyone summarize their key takeaway from the webinar that you would love people to walk away with. Just one thing. We'll start with Robert.
I would say for me, the one key takeaway is when you think about full funnel marketing, you're not moving away from lower funnel activity. When you start to think about full funnel marketing, it's about growing demand and capitalizing on that demand. So you're not making a trade-off when you start to think about full funnel marketing.
Love it. Scott?
Yeah, for me, I think the biggest thing is plan to learn and plan to track. So from the beginning, make sure we have a clear view of what we're going to view, test, and what we're going to measure, and make sure that those things align throughout the campaign and we're not going the side direction based on what we expected.
Perfect. Kristen?
I think for me, it's like, don't be afraid to test it. I know, a lot of times there's this like perceived, I think, risk with trying new things creatively. But if you're strategic about how you do it, you pick the channel, you're only putting a small portion of your budget to it. The like number of impressions that you're going to get on a, 5 to 10K test per campaign, sometimes in the grand scheme of things isn't a ton. And you can actually learn a lot from kind of stepping outside of your comfort zone in some ways to put it to the test. So I think, just really look at it through the lens of like, is this risky to my brand if I have it in a really structured testing environment? And a lot of times the answer is no. And to be willing to kind of try it to get the learnings and get the data.
I love it. So brand and demand, not a radical concept. Need to do it, need to test, and need to validate. And you can test and validate at a brand level and a demand gen level, where I feel like from a demand gen, we've always seen testing, you know, in the proof of the performance with the numbers, but you know, having clean data and things like that allow you to really test throughout the funnel and ensure not only how each channel is working or each phase of the funnel is working, but how it's working together. So I thank you all. I think all of our participants, we will be following up and sending a brand demand guide for you to review as a follow-up. And if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to follow up with us and we'd be more than happy to address those. Thank you guys.